4 words from Beijing, 9 words from Ottawa, and the most integrated bilateral economic relationship in human history suspended between them like a wire under impossible tension, waiting to learn which set of words reflected a plan and which one reflected the absence of one. Trump said his 4 words on May 14, 2026, standing at a podium in the Great Hall of the People with the full diplomatic machinery of the world's most powerful nation at his disposal, surrounded by the largest single concentration of American corporate leadership sent to Beijing in years, Boeing and Apple and BlackRock and Goldman Sachs and Tesla assembled as a display of American economic force. He said them into cameras that were broadcasting to every financial market on the planet. He said them with the confidence of a man who had just spent 48 hours reshaping the economic architecture of an entire continent in rooms where the affected continent was not represented. Good run's end? 4 words about Canada. 48 hours later, Mark Carney walked to a podium in Ottawa. 2 cameras, no teleprompter. A folder that he opened, read from briefly, and then closed before the most consequential sentence he would speak. He stood still for a moment. The room went quiet. He looked directly into the camera. And then he said 9 words that were broadcast on every major network across 3 continents within hours of their delivery. You have misread us, and the misreading will be expensive. 2 leaders, 2 sentences. $800 billion annually in bilateral trade sitting between them, waiting to learn which sentence described preparation and which one described its absence. The answer to that question is now becoming visible in the data. And the data is not ambiguous. To understand why a press conference in Ottawa at this specific moment is producing reverberations through financial markets and boardrooms and allied capitals that the official Beijing summit communique did not generate, you have to reconstruct what was actually agreed in Beijing before Trump arrived there publicly, what the North American Manufacturing Priority Act was specifically designed to accomplish, and what Carney was doing for 48 hours between the moment the Beijing agreements became fully public and the moment he walked to that podium with no teleprompter. 3 weeks before the official Beijing summit, a quiet delegation left Washington without a press pool, without an official schedule, and without a communique. They traveled on commercial flights. They checked into separate hotels. They met in a building that does not appear in any accessible registry. Over 72 hours, the architecture of what has now emerged as the most consequential backroom arrangement in North American economic history was drafted, revised, and agreed upon. Canada's industrial future was on the table in that building. Canada was not in the room. On May 13, 2026, the second day of Trump's official Beijing visit, the White House released a 407-page policy document called the North American Manufacturing Priority Act. The language was drafted by attorneys who understood precisely what they were constructing. The operative provision required no legal training to read. Any company seeking maximum American federal tax incentives, and after the new schedule those incentives were historic in their scale, was required to locate all strategic production lines inside the United States. Not the continent, not North America as a geographic designation, the United States specifically. Battery manufacturing, semiconductor fabrication, electric vehicle components, artificial intelligence infrastructure, data centers, defense supply chain inputs. Each category was enumerated with the precision of a document designed to eliminate interpretive ambiguity. And then came Section 14, Paragraph 3, a single provision written with the specific geography of Ontario's electric vehicle manufacturing corridor in mind, though it never named Ontario, never named Canada, never named any specific country. It did not need to. Any company relocating strategic production capacity from a USMCA partner nation to the United States within 18 months would receive an additional 15% tax credit on top of existing federal incentives. They were not merely creating an incentive to relocate American manufacturing to American soil, they were subsidizing the extraction of manufacturing capacity from an allied nation that had spent decades and tens of billions of dollars building that capacity inside its own territory. The same afternoon that the legislation was released, Beijing announced the largest single-year bilateral agricultural purchase framework in the history of Chinese-American trade relations. Soybeans, $42 billion. Beef, $18 billion. Pork, $11 billion. Wheat and feed grains, $23 billion. $94 billion in agricultural trade redirected in a single afternoon. Canada's canola exports to China, which had been running at meaningful volume for more than 2 decades, were not mentioned in the announcement. They did not need to be mentioned to be affected. When China commits to $94 billion of American agricultural purchases, the implied message to Canadian agricultural exporters is contained in the arithmetic of Chinese import capacity. Canada was not consulted before the legislation was released. Canada was not consulted before the agricultural framework was announced. Canada was not notified that these 2 instruments were being coordinated to produce a single strategic effect. A senior White House official speaking on condition of anonymity was quoted in the days that followed with a sentence that landed in Ottawa with the weight of something more devastating than a diplomatic threat because it was accurate about the intent rather than evasive about it. Why share industrial prosperity with Canada when America can keep all of it? That sentence was not a slip. It was the operational framing of Section 14, Paragraph 3. The most immediate industrial consequence landed in Ontario within 48 hours of the Beijing agreements becoming public. Ontario had invested more than $30 billion over the preceding decade in the specific industrial ecosystem positioned to make it the electric vehicle manufacturing capital of North America. Battery plants, component manufacturing lines, research corridors connecting university engineering departments to factory floors, workforce training programs that had been running long enough to produce a generation of skilled workers whose expertise existed nowhere else in the country at comparable scale. 3 major Chinese battery manufacturers holding signed letters of intent with Ontario facilities announced simultaneous decisions within 48 hours of the agreements going public. One relocated to Texas, one announced a new facility outside Phoenix, one issued a statement suspending all Canadian commitments indefinitely. Washington supplemented this with the announcement that Chinese companies choosing to manufacture inside the United States rather than Canada would receive streamlined regulatory approval, compressing processes that normally require years into 90 days. They were not just incentivizing the move, they were removing every friction point that had previously made the relocation complicated. The strategic minerals dimension of this confrontation is the element that transforms it from a bilateral trade dispute into a structural geopolitical realignment whose consequences extend to every major economy that depends on the physical materials the next century's industrial infrastructure requires. Canada possesses some of the largest deposits of lithium, nickel, cobalt, uranium, and rare earth elements on the planet. These are not optional industrial inputs. They are the physical material without which there is no electric vehicle, no advanced semiconductor, no modern defense system, no renewable energy installation. There is no climate transition and no technological competition at scale without the specific elements that Canada has in the ground and the infrastructure to bring to surface. For decades, this resource endowment was Canada's quiet strategic insurance. No major power could sideline a nation sitting on that scale of critical material wealth without consequences that rebounded on the power attempting the sidelining. The Beijing agreements were designed to neutralize that insurance through a coordinated two-front movement. Washington committed to dramatically accelerating domestic critical mineral extraction, fast-tracking permits stalled for years, directing the Defense Production Act toward American mining at a scale not seen since the Second World War. Beijing simultaneously agreed to redirect Chinese investment capital away from Canadian mining projects and toward American mineral development equivalents. Canadian mining stocks fell an average of 14% in the single week following Trump's return from Beijing. 2 major lithium projects in British Columbia, both carrying secured Chinese financing, saw that financing suspended within 10 days of the agreements going public. An internal assessment circulated to Canadian cabinet members, later obtained by investigative journalists, contained a sentence that captured the entire strategic shift in 18 words. Canada is at risk of becoming a raw material supplier, while all value-added production migrates south of the border. Not a partner in the supply chain, a quarry. This is the context within which Mark Carney's background matters not as biography, but as operational information about the specific man who read the agreements, made 3 phone calls, and then walked to a podium 48 hours later and delivered 9 words without notes. Carney was governor of the Bank of Canada. He guided the country through the 2008 financial crisis with more precision and less institutional damage than any comparable advanced economy achieved in the same period. He was then appointed governor of the Bank of England, the first and only non-British citizen in the institution's 300-year history to hold that role. 13 years before any of this, he had been a managing director at Goldman Sachs, navigating the most complex financial negotiations the private sector produces. This is not a politician who learned economics as a policy instrument. This is an economist who spent 3 decades at the absolute apex of the global financial system managing crises where trillions of dollars were at stake, negotiating with governments and institutions that held the leverage in those conversations, and learning in those rooms the specific lesson that defines the most consequential financial operators of any generation. The most dangerous people in any negotiation are never the ones who announce what they are going to do. They are the ones who have already done it before anyone else has noticed. The night the Beijing agreements became fully public, Carney did not call a press conference. He did not post on social media. He did not call Washington. He sat at his desk and read every page of the North American Manufacturing Priority Act, Section 14, Paragraph 3, every line of the Agricultural Contract Framework, the Critical Minerals Investment Redirection Provisions. 4 hours, then 3 phone calls. Not to Washington, not to London, to Tokyo, to Berlin, to a third capital that has not been publicly identified. 48 hours after Air Force One touched down at Joint Base Andrews, Mark Carney walked to a podium in Ottawa. What he said before the 9 words that became the 9 words deserves the full reconstruction because the 9 words derived their weight from the architecture of everything preceding them. Canada is not a bargaining chip. 3 seconds of silence while every camera in the room held without cutting. Canada is not a concession in someone else's framework. Canada is not a line item negotiated in rooms where it was not invited to sit. Canada is not a country whose industrial future gets decided by bilateral arrangements designed in its absence. 3 days ago, the President of the United States sat in Beijing and agreed with the government that Canada has been diplomatically managing with careful consistency since the Cold War to a set of arrangements designed explicitly to reduce Canada's manufacturing capacity, redirect Canada's export markets, and undermine Canada's investment environment. He did not consult us. He did not notify us. He did not extend the basic diplomatic courtesy that one nation extends to another after more than a century of alliance. He looked up from his notes. He looked directly into the camera. I want to respond to that clearly. Canada's economy does not need fixing by those who would dismantle it. It needs to be defended from those who treat partnership as value to be extracted and an alliance as a convenience to be discarded the moment a more profitable arrangement appears across the Pacific. He closed the folder. He did not look away from the camera. To those who believe that Canada will absorb this quietly, that patience is the same as weakness, that restraint is the same as submission. 3 seconds of complete silence. You have misread us, and the misreading will be expensive. The press conference was viewed 47 million times in the first 24 hours. Not because it was dramatic. Political speeches go viral for drama. This was not dramatic. It was cold and precise and controlled. The stillness of a man who was not performing certainty. He was reporting on preparation that had been underway for months. 47 million views because the people watching it, including the people in Washington who did not want to be watching it, understood that they were watching someone report rather than threaten. This is what I know. This is what I have planned. This is what is going to happen. Trump's response arrived the following morning on Truth Social. Carney is all talk, no action. Canada is a mess and he's giving speeches. Very weak. Very weak. Posted before the 6 counter-moves had fully become visible. By the time they did, the characterization required revision. The 6 moves that Carney executed in the 72 hours following the Beijing agreements becoming public will be studied in diplomatic and economic programs for a generation. None were announced as a package. None were presented as retaliation. Each was framed with deliberate precision as a routine exercise of Canadian sovereign economic policy. Together, they constituted the most coordinated economic counterpositioning by a mid-size power against a superpower in modern diplomatic history. Move 1. Canada formally notified the United States Trade Representative that it was initiating a comprehensive USMCA compliance review, specifically flagging Section 14's relocation incentives as potential violations of the agreement's investment neutrality provisions. Not a threat, a legal process, quiet, procedurally correct, and impossible to dismiss because it invokes a binding international agreement that the United States itself negotiated, signed, and has repeatedly cited as the governing framework for North American trade relationships. The compliance review has no scheduled resolution date. It will run, it will generate findings, and those findings will have legal weight that press conference denials cannot override. Move 2. Canada announced an emergency expansion of its Critical Minerals Investment Authority, a new sovereign fund capitalized at $40 billion, specifically structured to replace the Chinese investment capital that had been redirected away from Canadian mining projects by the Beijing agreements. Sovereign funds of this capitalization do not appear fully structured 48 hours after the triggering event unless the legal framework, the funding mechanism, and the investment mandate were prepared before the triggering event occurred. Carney had been building this since his Tokyo phone call, possibly before. Move 3. Canada announced a new bilateral industrial partnership with the European Union, a fast-track manufacturing investment corridor that EU trade officials had been drafting for 3 months, waiting for exactly this political moment. The Brussels announcement arrived with complete documentation because it had been prepared in anticipation of a moment when Canadian assets would become available at a discount, and the European Union would have the commercial and strategic justification to acquire positions at scale. Move 4. Canada announced preferential market access agreements with Japan, South Korea, and Australia for critical mineral supply, positioning Canada as the primary alternative to Chinese mineral supply for allied nations, increasingly focused on supply chain resilience. Japan, South Korea, and Australia are 3 of the 4 economies whose industrial base most urgently requires a trusted alternative to Chinese mineral supply chain dominance. Canada has now become the explicit preferred alternative supplier for all 3 simultaneously, using the moment that was designed to isolate Canada commercially to instead anchor Canada structurally into the Allied industrial architecture. Move 5. Carney's office released a comprehensive economic impact assessment of what American supply chains actually depend on from Canada. Not a political document? An economic document prepared by Statistics Canada and 3 independent research institutions. The numbers were specific and designed to be specific. $800 billion in annual bilateral trade, 3.2 million American jobs directly dependent on Canadian supply chains. 41% of total American crude oil imports with no viable alternative source within a 5-year horizon. These numbers were not produced for the press conference. They were produced for the boardrooms of the 3.2 million American workers' employers, for the energy market analysts who track the 41% crude dependency, and for the bond market participants, central bank governors, and allied capitals whose financial and strategic calculations are built on those numbers. Move 6 was the most operationally consequential and the one that produced the most immediate measurable results. Carney personally called the chief executives of 11 major American corporations with significant operations in both countries, not to threaten them, to inform them. He told each of them calmly and with complete specificity exactly what Section 14 relocation incentives would cost them in Canadian regulatory cooperation, Canadian resource access, and Canadian market participation if they chose to pursue them. He was not issuing ultimatums. He was doing the arithmetic with them out loud in real time, allowing each executive to perform the calculation that their own financial advisors would eventually present to them anyway. When the calls were done, 7 of the 11 companies publicly announced they were pausing any relocation review pending further regulatory clarity. 3 companies did not move immediately but have since initiated their own internal reviews. One company proceeded. It has subsequently discovered that the 90-day streamlined regulatory approval that Washington advertised has in practice involved timelines considerably closer to 4 years. The American regulatory framework actually mandates that timeline regardless of political preference. The preference and the process are different instruments operated by different branches of the government on different calendars. Now look at what the data shows 3 weeks after the Beijing summit, because the secondary and tertiary effects of the confrontation are now distinguishing between the strategic positions that were announced and the strategic positions that were real. The 3 Chinese battery manufacturers that pivoted away from Ontario within 48 hours of the Beijing agreements have not all stayed pivoted. 2 have quietly reinitiated contact with their original Canadian partners. The reason is not diplomatic pressure. The reason is not political sentiment. The reason is arithmetic. The Ontario ecosystem that $30 billion of provincial investment produced over a decade cannot be replicated in a greenfield American location in 18 months at a cost that the 15% additional tax credit covers. The infrastructure was built. The workforce was trained. The supply chain connections were established. The regulatory relationships were operational. Recreating all of that in Texas or Arizona on the timeline, the Section 14 incentive structure implied requires capital and time that erases the incentive the tax credit was supposed to provide. The battery manufacturers did the math. Canada was still faster. Canada was still cheaper when the total investment cost of relocation was accurately modeled rather than estimated from the headline credit rate. The $94 billion agricultural framework between Beijing and Washington has produced its own secondary dynamics. Canadian canola exports to China fell sharply in the immediate period following the announcement. Grain farmers in Saskatchewan experienced the acute economic pain that the futures market price collapse on the day of the announcement had telegraphed. One farmer outside Regina, who had exported canola to China for 22 years, sat in his truck in his own field for 40 minutes before he could bring himself to call his bank. He was not performing distress. He said 2 words about what had happened to him. "We are being replaced." 2 words that captured the entire human dimension of a geopolitical transaction executed in rooms where neither he nor anyone representing his interests was present. But within 30 days, Canada had accelerated negotiations with India and Indonesia to absorb the displaced agricultural export volume at comparable price points. The market diversification that the Beijing displacement forced Canada to execute has produced a more resilient agricultural export architecture than the single dominant buyer model that preceded the agreements. The pain was real. The structural result may be more durable than the arrangement it replaced. The critical minerals gap has produced the result that most directly contradicts the strategic logic of the Beijing agreements. 3 European sovereign wealth funds committed a combined $22 billion to Canadian mining projects in the weeks following the agreements. Capital that had been watching the Canadian mining sector with careful interest, positioned to move when the moment created the opportunity. Trump had engineered a sale. The buyers who arrived were European. The strategic consequence of European sovereign capital owning significant positions in Canadian critical mineral production is a different geopolitical outcome from the one the agreements were designed to produce. The agreements were designed to leave Canada without the investment capital to develop its critical mineral assets, creating the conditions for Washington to position American domestic extraction as the alternative supply base for Allied critical mineral demand. Instead, Allied capital flowed to Canadian assets, making Canada the critical mineral supplier of record for European, Japanese, Korean, and Australian industrial demand, while simultaneously giving those economies a direct financial stake in Canadian resource development that creates its own structural support for Canadian supply chain integration with the broader Allied architecture. A Wall Street analyst note that circulated to every major financial desk covering North American trade contained one sentence that the distribution record shows was forwarded more than any other single sentence in the note. The administration appears to have confused Canada's patience with Canada's weakness. The distinction is becoming expensive. That observation is not partisan commentary. It is the financial sector's reading of the transaction data, the corporate announcement patterns, the investment flow records, and the compliance review timeline that together constitute the measurable outcomes of the confrontation through the current period. And then there is the 4-second pause. 1 week after Air Force One returned from Beijing, a journalist at a White House press briefing asked the press secretary whether the administration had calculated what a successful Canadian USMCA compliance claim would cost American businesses in the affected sectors. The press secretary said the administration was not concerned about that. The journalist followed up by asking whether the administration had reviewed the Canadian Economic Impact Assessment, the document showing 3.2 million American jobs tied to Canadian supply chains. The press secretary said they would take a look at that. Then the journalist asked the question the entire exchange had been building toward. When the president said Canada's good run is over, is that the official position of this administration on the alliance? The press secretary paused. 4 seconds. On camera? In a professional function whose entire operational requirement is the production of answers without hesitation. Then she said, next question. That 4-second pause was broadcast on every major Canadian network that evening, played directly adjacent to footage of Carney's 9-word sentence. The contrast required no commentary from any anchor or analyst. One moment showed a man who had looked into a camera with no notes and said exactly what he meant with the stillness of someone who had prepared every word and knew the words were accurate. The other moment showed someone needing 4 seconds to decide what they were permitted to say, and then choosing silence over the saying. Pull back from the specific moments and see the complete picture that is assembling itself across the data of the 3 weeks following the Beijing summit. The North American Manufacturing Priority Act is law. Section 14 is in effect. The agricultural contracts are signed. The investment flows have begun moving in the direction the agreements intended. These are real and consequential outcomes. The agreements produced what they were designed to produce in their immediate phase. Simultaneously, 7 of the 11 American CEOs Carney called have paused relocation reviews. 2 of the 3 Chinese battery manufacturers have reinitiated contact with Canadian partners. 3 European sovereign wealth funds have committed $22 billion to Canadian mining. Canada has signed preferential mineral supply agreements with Japan, South Korea, and Australia. The EU fast-track industrial corridor is being built. The USMCA compliance review is running without a scheduled end date. The $40 billion Critical Minerals Sovereign Fund is capitalized. The Economic Impact Assessment with 3.2 million American jobs is on record at every financial desk covering North American trade. And the 4-second pause is in the archive. The question that the next 12 months of outcomes will resolve is the question that every boardroom, every financial desk, every allied capital, and every sovereignty-conscious middle power is now watching to answer. Whether the man who announced the end of Canada's good run had modeled what happens when the country whose good run he announced over turns out to have been preparing for exactly that announcement for the better part of a year. Carney made 3 phone calls the night the agreements became public. Tokyo, Berlin, an unidentified third capital. The calls happened before anyone in Washington had finished reading the coverage of what the agreements produced. The Sovereign Fund was ready to be announced. The EU corridor was ready to be announced. The preferential mineral agreements were ready to be announced. The CEO calls were ready to be made. The compliance review was ready to be filed. None of this was improvised in the 48 hours between the Beijing announcements and the Ottawa press conference. All of it was prepared before the 48 hours began. The preparation is visible in the precision. The precision is visible in the timeline. The timeline is visible in the outcomes. Good run's end? 4 words from the Great Hall of the People. You have misread us, and the misreading will be expensive. 9 words from Ottawa, no teleprompter, folder closed before the sentence was delivered. 1 set of words reflected a plan. The data is resolving which one? The misreading that Carney described without raising his voice is now being priced, quarterly, in the account statements of the corporations that moved, the pension funds of the workers their supply chains employ, the currencies of the countries watching the confrontation as a model for their own bilateral management, and the investment flows that are now being redirected by sovereign wealth funds that arrived at the sale that Trump created and bought what was on offer. The preparation was the answer. The answer was already complete before the question was asked. That is what the 3-second pause before the 9 words communicated to everyone who watched it with enough experience to recognize what they were seeing, not performance. Preparation? And the preparation, as the data is now confirming across every sector and every market and every allied capital that was watching, was complete before Trump said the 4 words that made the 9 words necessary.